There's so many different types of media available on the market today, it starts getting difficult to choose which one is going to be best for your orchids. You've been told to use this one or to use that one. Well, let's look into the different types of media, have a look at their pros and cons, and see which ones are going to suit you best. Welcome to the Nature Company. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. With the smorgasbord of different items available to put into your orchid mix, it starts getting confusing as to what should go with what and how should I mix it, or should I just use them straight. Well, we'll go through just some of the few, like the rocks and stones, the man-made items, charcoal, barks, sphagnum moss, different types of peat, coir. We'll go through them all separately, and this should help you get a better idea of what you're going to need and what sort of mixes you might want to do to suit your orchid. We'll start with one of the most common, bark. It comes in many different forms for different requirements. Your large pieces, you're generally going to be using this either for things like vandas and that don't really want all that moisture hanging around them. The medium-sized chunks such as this can be used very well for cattleyas. And then we start looking at the smaller barks and the fine bark. So generally this is considered landscape, decorative, orchid and fine bark. The advantages of using bark is it's a natural substance. It's basically what the orchid would have been growing on anyway. If they're epiphytic, they would have been growing on the bark of a tree. It's got all the tannins in it that are often helpful for orchid growth, but also they have a very mild acidic pH, which is actually just right for orchid cultivation. Those are some of the good qualities. Also, they generally all come as irregular pieces. So when they're all sitting together, there's a lot of air gaps in between, which is exactly what the orchid roots are looking for, is all that good air in between so they can breathe. But not only that, with those air gaps, it allows for excellent drainage. And bark, not being terribly absorbent, will get to a certain saturation point and never go beyond that. And that water will just drain straight through so as not to keep your orchids too wet. The trick with bark is choosing your grade of bark that is going to suit your orchid. So those like cattleyas, which like to dry out quickly, we're going to be choosing a larger grade bark. Things like Phalaenopsis, which might need to be kept a little bit more moist, we can use this very fine grade bark or the thicker grade orchid bark. One of the problems with bark is it decomposes. So after a year or two, you're going to need to repot. But invariably this is a good thing for your orchid anyway, to refresh the root system, take away any of that old dead material so as to avoid any fungal and bacterial attacks. Also, orchid bark being very light is not going to weigh your pot down, making them easy to move. It's also excellent for indoor and outdoor culture. The one problem with bark is you always have to be aware of the quality that you're getting. When you're looking for bark, you're looking for pieces that are all irregular shaped, and we want them to be nice chunks. We're not looking for fine slivers. This is a very poor grade bark, and this is going to cause your orchid to rot. It's going to hold too much moisture. It's going to allow for bacteria and for fungus to thrive, and this will rot your orchid quickly. So rather look for chunky, irregular shapes as opposed to fine slivers. These just sit together and not allow that airspace or air or water movement to happen. Also, a bonus with bark is it is an organic substance, so you're not going to be ruining the environment by using it. And also, being organic and with all these irregular shapes in it, it's going to allow for that all those good microorganisms to grow and thrive in your media, which help actually protect your orchid in the long run. Also, because it takes a while for it to absorb a lot of water, if your bark is not moist when you're initially planting your orchid into it, it is going to absorb moisture away from your plant. So ensure that you have at least soaked it for a good couple of hours, up to 24 hours before actually using it, so that you can be sure it is fully hydrated and it's not going to absorb the moisture away from your plant. Also, once it's been dried out for long times, it becomes hydrophilic It really won't absorb water. The water will just run off over the top of it and spill out the bottom of your pot. So your watering regime with bark does have to be quite precise, and that all depends on the grade of bark that you're using. Also, feeding with certain feeds, such as the chemical feeds with bark, can cause your pH levels in the bark to drop further, which will decompose your bark faster, and this then can become problematic to your orchids. So all these positives and negatives that you've got to think of and weigh up, is this going to be suitable for me? And what can I mix this with to make a media that's actually going to suit my orchids and the environment that I'm in, along with my watering techniques. We've gone through charcoal before. It's a wonderful ingredient to use, especially with those orchids that like to have that moisture removed from their root zone quickly. It doesn't particularly hold any water in it, but it does clean any water that we're using. It's effective as a water filter, so allowing a better quality of water for your plant once it is in the media. It can come in different sizes, and you'll be using these sizes in relation to the size of your plants, the pot that you're using, and often with the thickness of the roots. Also, the one nice thing about charcoal is it can be broken up further from the bigger sizes into the size that you might need for your specific orchid. Charcoal can also be relatively easy to obtain and is inexpensive. And with the good air gaps that it provides, along with the non-decomposition that takes place, so this is going to last and last and last. You're not going to have to repot your orchid continually if you're using charcoal, especially if you're mixing it with other inorganic materials, as it will hold its form and it's not going to decompose further. So charcoal also can be cleaned and used again and again and again. So it also provides excellent drainage, especially if you're adding it into medias that aren't so well drained, as well as I said earlier, providing it with that filtering for your water. And some other inorganic medias that we use are rocks and stones and pebbles and even sand. In the US you probably call this grit. It's a coarse river sand that we use mostly in our ground orchids. So here also, being inorganic, they're not going to decompose, they're going to last forever and ever and ever, and can be reused if sanitized and cleaned properly. The larger ones, of course, are mainly used to stabilize the base of large pots and to allow for the filling of a lot of space without causing any excess moisture holding capacities at the bottom of a pot that may then cause problems for your plants later. Although it will then make your pots heavier and more difficult to move, which is a good thing if they are in windy conditions to keep them upright. That's what we use the big ones for. This is a 19 mil granite stone, which is inert. It produces large air spaces also because of the irregular shapes that they come in. They're not going to, as I said, because they're rock, they're not going to decompose. They're not going to compact in your media. Unless you're using them with certain other medias which are lighter, then your stones, the weight of them could slowly push down on that media, compacting them in between those spaces, and then you could start having problems. So when working with stone, be a little bit more careful. Put the majority of your stone towards the bottom so that the top isn't just pushed down by that stone, the weight of the stone, and blocking up those air spaces. Also incredibly well drained because they have no water holding capacity. So when using stones and pebbles, remember you have to watch your watering because they will dry out incredibly quickly. So you may have to water more frequently when using things like this. But again, when mixing them with the right other ingredients to hold moisture, as long as you're putting them in the right positions or using the right tap with the right ameliorations, everything will be fine. As I said again, the grit, this is for adding a fast draining media to your ground orchids. And then again, some more organic medias. Your sphagnum mosses, your coir peat, and your peat moss. These are all high water retaining media. They have very slow decomposition rates, so they're going to last a long time. But remember, when putting media such as this in with your orchids for the first time, make sure they're moistened. because again, they're going to draw moisture into them, away from your orchids if they're completely dry when used. The sphagnum moss holds incredibly large amounts of water, so for those particularly water-loving plants or mounted plants or plants that you're really just not going to water frequently, sphagnum moss is a really good idea. The coir chunks, these are wonderful things because they allow for all that good air movement in between them. They also absorb incredibly large amounts of water but actually hold it quite close to them. They're also very fibrous, and the orchid root can actually grow straight through your coir chunks. It's a wonderful media for water-loving orchids or orchids that need that extra moisture. I especially like using them with my Cymbidiums. It provides that extra moisture and humidity around the pot, and with their fine little roots going into those basically sponges of water, they just love it. And your peats, your coir peat and your peat moss, these are generally for things like Phalaenopsis, Pebbles, things like that. But again, their moisture retaining qualities are extremely high, so you need to be careful with your watering. You have to water only very infrequently. But the other problem is when it gets to a very dry state, it is absolutely water phobic. So your water is really not going to be absorbed. It takes a long time to rehydrate it. You're going to have to be careful not to allow it to dry out too far. Otherwise, you're going to be soaking your pot in water for days. Well, not really, but it feels like it. Often your sphagnum moss can come in compact packs like this that you then have to hydrate out and loosen up. The longer fibers the better. That allows them to sit more evenly through the mix and allowing for those air spaces. And no matter how dry it gets, it absorbs water really quickly and easily. So that's one of the reasons it's so often used around orchids. As well as the amount of water it holds means it's not going to dry out too quickly. So it's a nice fluffy mix that will still allow your orchid roots to breathe. And then of course, with your ground orchids again, things like good quality compost, and I also often use a mixed bark mulch that is generally used for top dressing flower beds and vegetable beds. I use this in the mix as well. It's just to help aerate the mix and allow for a faster drainage and adding that extra organic component into your soil. And now for some of the man-made products that we use in our orchids. These are all also inorganic products, so they're not going to decompose in your media. The vermiculite is a moisture retaining rock that's been expanded, and this is used to hold moisture in media. Often with this, I'm going to be using this mostly in my ground orchids. I don't really use this in anything else. Perhaps with a Phalaenopsis, perhaps with a Pebbles, I might be using that into my peat moss, which actually works really well. I actually prefer using that with peat moss than the perlite. It's a nice light mix. It allows for good air movement and, as I said, holds all that good moisture. Also excellent for retention of nutrients. Then we have things like our styrofoam, but people, please be conscious when using styrofoam. Don't go buy new styrofoam or polystyrene to put into your orchids. Rather use old polystyrene or styrofoam that you've received in packaging, such as around any old household items or such, and that you can just break up into pieces. Use that. Often it's used at the base of the pots to fill up space so that you don't have moisture retaining elements there, to allow for that drainage, or otherwise mixed throughout your media so as to allow for a lot of air spaces in between and a lighter, more well-drained media altogether, all round. So let's not go add more junk into the environment than need be. But that said, using old, reusing, repurposing styrofoam that's already been used for something else that's just going to go into the tip for your orchids is a good idea. Then we have our light expanded clay aggregates. This is lacquer. It comes in multiple different forms, different sizes. You can choose them to suit how you're going to be planting or whether they're going to be visible or not. They also come in multiple different colors, especially nowadays. They come in decorative ones that you can use in clear pots. And lacquer itself is an amazing media. It has a very strong EC, which allows it to move water around your pot. So if there's a lot of water at the base, what it does, it moves it around the edges of the lacquer and up towards the roots. Also, because of this EC, it also holds the nutrients that you're spraying on your plants to be kept for longer, so that they're more available to your plant for longer periods. Because they're inorganic, they're not going to absorb water. The water is just going to run straight through them, allowing for that excellent drainage. All their round shape allow for massive amounts of air gaps in between the media, so your orchid roots can breathe beautifully. But remember again, these are going to dry incredibly quickly, especially since they've got all that air movement that can just blow straight through them. It's going to dry up that moisture so quickly, especially if you're in warmer climates. So be careful of your watering with them, but other than that, they're an amazing media to work with. And also, because they're inorganic, they're going to be able to be washed, cleaned, sterilized, and used again and again. No need for disposal. And they make an excellent mix with other media, especially if you're wanting to hold extra moisture without compaction. You can use your lacquer with sphagnum moss, and then you get not only that good air movement, that good drainage, but you get that extra added water holding capacity of the sphagnum moss to keep your orchids happy. And then we have perlite. Perlite also has excellent water absorbing qualities. It's going to help retain moisture in your plant, and if you are able, rather get the perlite in its larger form than this, but this is all we're able to get here. You generally can get it in all sorts of different sizes and shapes depending on where you base. The bigger your perlite balls, actually the better it's going to be, especially to allow for that air movement through. So with the perlite, we're going to be adding it to things like your lacquer, to your bark, and other media that's not going to be so water retentive. And of course, there's things like old pots. Old pottery is such a wonderful thing to use in your pots, because you're going to be landing up with all these different shapes and sizes that aren't really going to be sitting together. They're going to be allowing for good air movement, good drainage, and it's good use of what would otherwise be waste material. Also, these clay pieces are breathable, allowing for better air movement in and around your plant. They'll absorb small amounts of water, which are going to be released over time, and this makes it a wonderful media to work with or to add to other media to either plump up the size, so you're not spending a lot of money on something like your lacquer. Also, it works well mixed with styrofoam, and then perhaps a little bit of bark if you need some more moisture retaining qualities to your media. So we've been through a wide selection of different media now. Hopefully I've given you enough information on each of them so that you can start making decisions as how you want to mix them and what is going to be best for your orchids and the environment you're in, and also for your watering and feeding schedules. These are not all of the ingredients that are available. There's also things like rock wool, which is something that I avoid completely. You need to be wearing masks and protective gear to be dealing with it, as far as I understand. And also the energy used to produce it is quite extreme and not something I'd particularly want to use when I have such a wide variety of other things available. And thank you for watching. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.